The school bell rang, signaling the end of another day at Oakwood Elementary. As children poured out of the building, laughing and chattering excitedly about their plans for the afternoon, 11-year-old Sophie hung back, her eyes scanning the crowd nervously. When she finally spotted her best friend Lily, relief washed over her face. "Lily!" Sophie called out, her voice barely audible above the din of excited students. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Lily, a bubbly girl with curly red hair and freckles, bounded over to her friend. Her smile faltered as she took in Sophie's appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she hugged her backpack tightly to her chest like a shield. "Sure, Soph," Lily said, her brow furrowing with concern. "What's up?" Sophie glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. "Not here," she whispered, grabbing Lily's hand and pulling her towards a quiet corner of the schoolyard. Once they were alone, Sophie took a deep breath, her eyes filling with tears. "He's doing it again," she said, her voice trembling. Lily's heart raced. She had never seen her usually cheerful friend look so frightened. "Who's doing what?" she asked gently, reaching out to squeeze Sophie's hand. Sophie shook her head, looking away. I can't say more. You have to promise me you won't tell anyone? Lily? Please." Lily hesitated. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could tell that whatever it was seriously upsetting Sophie. Part of her wanted to run and tell a teacher right away, but the pleading look in Sophie's eyes stopped her. "Okay," Lily said finally. "I promise I won't tell anyone. But Sophie, if someone's hurting you—" "No," Sophie interrupted quickly. "It's not like that. It's just complicated. I shouldn't have said anything. Just forget it, okay?" Before Lily could respond, Sophie's name rang out across the schoolyard. Sophie flinched at the sound, her eyes widening with fear. "That's my mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to go. Remember, you promised not to tell anyone." With that, Sophie turned and ran towards the waiting car, leaving Lily standing alone, confused and worried. As she watched her friend climb into the car, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Sophie's words echoed in her mind. He's doing it again. Who was he? And what was he doing that had Sophie so scared? Lily walked home slowly that afternoon, her usual bounce gone from her step. She kept replaying the conversation with Sophie in her head, trying to make sense of it. Sophie had always been a bit quiet, but this was different. The fear in her eyes, the way she had begged Lily to keep her secret, it all felt wrong. As Lily approached her house, she saw her mom, Karen, watering the flowers in the front yard. For a moment, Lily considered telling her mom everything. Karen always knew how to make things better, and Lily was sure she would know what to do about Sophie. But then she remembered her promise. Sophie had trusted her with this secret, and Lily didn't want to betray that trust. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe Sophie would tell her more tomorrow, and they could figure it out together. "Hey, sweetie," Karen called out, waving as Lily approached. "How was school today?" Lily forced a smile, pushing her worries to the back of her mind. "It was fine, Mom," she said, giving Karen a quick hug before heading inside. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Lily made a silent vow. She would keep Sophie's secret for now, but she would also keep a close eye on her friend. If things got worse, or if Sophie showed any signs of being in real danger, Lily would tell an adult, promise or no promise. For now, though, all Lily could do was wait and hope that whatever was troubling Sophie would pass. Little did she know, the whispered confession in the schoolyard was just the beginning of a situation that would soon spiral beyond anything she could have imagined. Karen hummed softly to herself as she prepared dinner, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables a soothing counterpoint to the gentle bubbling of the pot on the stove. It had been a quiet evening so far, with Lily holed up in her room, ostensibly doing homework. But something about her daughter's demeanor when she came home from school had set off a faint alarm bell in Karen's mind. As if on cue, Lily wandered into the kitchen, her brow furrowed in thought. She hopped onto a stool at the kitchen island, absently twirling a strand of her red hair around her finger, a habit Karen knew meant her daughter was troubled about something. "Hey, sweetie," Karen said casually, not wanting to push too hard. "How's the homework coming along?" Lily shrugged, her eyes fixed on the countertop. "It's okay. Mom, can I ask you something?" Karen set down her knife, giving Lily her full attention. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" Lily hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. If a friend told you something that worried you, but made you promise not to tell anyone, what would you do?" Karen's maternal instincts, already on alert, went into overdrive. She kept her voice calm as she replied, "Well, that would depend on what they told me. If I thought my friend might be in danger, I would probably need to tell someone who could help, even if it meant breaking my promise." "Why do you ask?" Lily's eyes widened slightly, and she quickly shook her head. "No reason, just something we were talking about in class today." Karen wasn't convinced, but she knew pushing too hard might make Lily clam up completely. Instead, she decided to approach the subject indirectly. "How are things going with your friends at school? How's Sophie doing?" At the mention of Sophie's name, Lily's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a flicker of worry crossing her face before she schooled her features into a neutral expression. "Sophie's fine," she said, a little too quickly. "She just seemed a bit nervous today. She said something about someone doing something again, but I'm sure it's nothing." Karen's heart skipped a beat. She knew Sophie well. The quiet, sweet girl had been Lily's best friend for years. The idea that Sophie might be in some kind of trouble was deeply concerning. "What do you mean? Someone doing something again?" Karen probed gently. Lily squirmed in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know. She didn't really explain." "Can we talk about something else?" Karen nodded, not wanting to push Lily further. "Of course, sweetie. Why don't you tell me about that science project you've been working on?" As Lily launched into an explanation of her experiment on plant growth, Karen listened with half an ear, her mind racing. Something was clearly wrong with Sophie, and Lily knew more than she was letting on. But what could it be, and how could Karen help without betraying Lily's trust or potentially making the situation worse? Over dinner, Karen observed Lily closely. Her usually chatty daughter was subdued, pushing her food around her plate more than eating it. Several times, Karen caught Lily staring off into space, a worried frown creasing her forehead. After Lily had gone to bed, Karen sat at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea forgotten before her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was in some kind of trouble. The phrase Lily had mentioned, "someone doing something again," sent a chill down her spine. It hinted at a pattern of behavior, something ongoing that was causing Sophie distress. Karen's mind whirled with possibilities, each more worrying than the last. Was Sophie being bullied at school? Was there trouble at home? Or was it something even more sinister? She thought about calling Sophie's mother, Amanda, to share her concerns. But what if she was overreacting? What if by voicing her suspicions, she created problems where there were none? Or worse, what if Amanda was somehow involved in whatever was troubling Sophie? No, Karen decided. She needed more information before she took any drastic steps. She would keep a close eye on the situation, watch for any further signs that Sophie was in distress. She'd pay closer attention when Sophie came over to play, maybe even reach out to some of the other parents to see if they'd noticed anything unusual. As she finally headed to bed, Karen made a silent vow. She would get to the bottom of this mystery, one way or another. Sophie was like a second daughter to her, and the thought of the sweet, shy girl suffering in silence was unbearable. Little did Karen know, her decision to investigate would set in motion a chain of events that would change multiple lives forever. As she drifted off to sleep, her mind still churning with worry and half-formed plans, the first threads of a web of secrets and hidden pain began to unravel. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of unease for Karen. She found herself watching Sophie closely whenever the girl came over to play with Lily, searching for any signs that might hint at what was troubling her. At first glance, Sophie seemed much the same as always. Quiet, polite, with a shy smile that lit up her face when she laughed at one of Lily's jokes. But the more Karen observed, the more she noticed subtle changes in Sophie's behavior. The dark circles under her eyes seemed to deepen with each passing day, and her normally impeccable appearance was becoming increasingly disheveled. Sophie's shoulders were often hunched, as if she was trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. One afternoon, as Karen served the girls an after-school snack, she overheard a snippet of conversation that made her blood run cold. "He keeps appearing when I least expect it," Sophie whispered to Lily, her voice barely audible. "I can't sleep, Lily. I'm always on edge, wondering when he'll show up next." Karen's hand trembled as she set down the plate of cookies, nearly dropping it. She quickly busied herself at the sink, straining to hear more without alerting the girls to her presence. Lily's voice was filled with concern as she replied, "Sophie, this isn't right. You need to tell someone. My mom could help." "No." Sophie's response was sharp, panicked. "You promised. Lily, you can't tell anyone. It'll only make things worse." The conversation abruptly shifted to homework as the girls noticed Karen nearby, but the damage was done. Karen's mind raced with the implications of what she'd overheard. Who was this he that Sophie was so afraid of? And why did Sophie think telling someone would make things worse? That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Karen sat at the kitchen table with her husband, Tom, sharing her concerns. "I just don't know what to do, Tom," she said, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "Something is clearly wrong, but Sophie's terrified of anyone finding out, and Lily, she's caught in the middle, trying to help her friend but feeling bound by her promise to keep quiet." Tom reached across the table, squeezing Karen's hand reassuringly. "You're doing the right thing by keeping an eye on the situation. Maybe we could invite Sophie over more often, give her a safe space if she needs it." Karen nodded, grateful for her husband's support. "That's a good idea. I just wish there was more we could do." As the days turned into weeks, Karen's worry only grew. Sophie's visits to their house became more frequent, and Karen couldn't help but notice how the girl seemed to relax once she was inside, as if she was entering a safe haven. One evening, as Karen was helping Sophie with her math homework while Lily was at soccer practice, she decided to gently probe for more information. "Sophie, honey," she began cautiously. "You know you can always talk to me if something's bothering you, right? About anything at all." Sophie's pencil stilled on her paper, her body tensing visibly. "I'm fine, Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice small. "Really?" Karen's heart ached at the fear she could hear in Sophie's voice. "Are you sure, sweetheart? Because if someone is making you uncomfortable or scared—" "No," Sophie interrupted, her eyes wide with panic. "No one's doing anything. I'm just tired. Can we please just finish the homework?" Karen backed off, not wanting to push Sophie too far. But as she watched the girl return to her math problems, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped her pencil, Karen knew she couldn't ignore the situation any longer. That night, after both girls were asleep, Sophie was staying over for a sleepover. Karen made a decision. She would reach out to Sophie's teachers, see if they had noticed any changes in her behavior or performance at school. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Karen drifted off to sleep, her mind still churning with worry, she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Whatever was happening to Sophie, it was clear that the situation was escalating. Karen just hoped she could find a way to help before it was too late. Little did she know, the truth behind Sophie's fear was more complex and heartbreaking than she could have imagined. And uncovering that truth would require courage, compassion, and a willingness to step into the uncomfortable spaces where secrets fester and grow. The following Monday, Karen found herself walking through the halls of Oakwood Elementary, her heart pounding with a mix of determination and anxiety. She had managed to schedule a meeting with Sophie's homeroom teacher, Mrs. Anderson, under the guise of discussing Lily's progress. But Karen had a hidden agenda: to discreetly gather information about any changes in Sophie's behavior at school. As she entered the classroom, Karen was struck by how small and vulnerable the students' desks looked. Somewhere in this room, Sophie sat every day, carrying the weight of her secret. The thought made Karen's resolve strengthen. Mrs. Anderson greeted her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Johnson, it's nice to see you. How can I help you today?" Karen took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Well, I wanted to check in on Lily's progress, of course. But I also had a question about Sophie. As you know, she and Lily are best friends. And I've noticed Sophie seeming a bit off lately. I was wondering if you'd observed any changes in her behavior or performance in class?" Mrs. Anderson's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of concern. "I'm glad you brought this up, Mrs. Johnson. To be honest, I have been worried about Sophie. Her grades have started to slip, and she seems constantly distracted in class. Just last week, she fell asleep during a lesson, which is very unlike her." Karen's heart sank. It was clear that Sophie's troubles weren't confined to her home life. "Has Sophie mentioned anything to you? Any problems at home or with other students?" Mrs. Anderson shook her head. "No, she hasn't said anything specific, but there have been a few times when I've asked her to stay after class, thinking she might open up. Each time, she seemed almost panicked at the thought of being late getting home." As they continued to talk, Karen's concern deepened. Mrs. Anderson shared that Sophie had stopped participating in class discussions, that she often seemed jumpy and nervous, and that she had withdrawn from her other friendships, relying almost exclusively on Lily for social interaction. Leaving the school, Karen felt a mixture of validation and increased worry. Her instincts about Sophie had been right. Something was definitely wrong. But what could she do with this information? Over the next few days, Karen's investigation continued. She reached out to other parents under various pretexts, casually bringing up Sophie in conversation. She volunteered for lunch duty at the school, using the opportunity to observe Sophie in a different setting. She even considered driving by Sophie's house in the evenings, though she ultimately decided that would be crossing a line. Each new piece of information added to the growing picture of a child in distress. Sophie's participation in after-school activities had dropped off. She was often seen waiting alone long after other children had been picked up. And perhaps most worryingly, there were whispered concerns about Sophie's home life, comments about her mother's new boyfriend, and changes in the household dynamics. As Karen pieced together the fragments of information, a theory began to form in her mind. But the implications were so troubling that she hesitated to even think them, let alone voice them aloud. One evening, as Karen was preparing dinner, she overheard Lily on the phone with Sophie. Her daughter's voice was low and urgent. "Sophie, you can't keep living like this. You need to tell someone what's going on. Please, let me help you." There was a pause, and then Lily's voice again, more insistent this time. "I know you're scared, but this isn't right. He shouldn't be making you feel this way. You deserve to feel safe in your own home." Karen's heart raced. She knew she shouldn't be eavesdropping, but the urgency in Lily's voice made it impossible for her to walk away. She strained to hear Sophie's response, but could only make out muffled sounds from the other end of the line. After Lily hung up, Karen debated whether to confront her daughter about the conversation. But she knew that if she revealed she'd been listening, she risked damaging the trust between them. And right now, that trust might be the only lifeline Sophie had. Instead, Karen redoubled her efforts to uncover the truth. She reached out to a friend who worked as a counselor at the local middle school, describing Sophie's behavior in general terms and asking for advice. The counselor's response was troubling. "Based on what you're describing," her friend said, her voice grave, "it sounds like this child might be experiencing some form of emotional abuse or neglect. The withdrawal, the anxiety, the fear of being late getting home. These are all red flags. Has there been any change in the child's home situation recently?" Karen's mind flashed to the rumors she'd heard about Sophie's mother's new boyfriend. "Yes," she said slowly. "I believe there's a new adult male figure in the home." The counselor sighed heavily. "That could certainly be a factor. Listen, Karen, if you genuinely believe this child is in danger, you have a responsibility to report it, but tread carefully. False accusations can do a lot of damage." As she hung up the phone, Karen felt the weight of responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She knew she needed to act, but how? If she reported her suspicions to Child Protective Services and was wrong, she could destroy Sophie's family and her own relationship with Lily. But if she was right and did nothing, the consequences for Sophie could be devastating. Karen decided she needed one more piece of evidence before she could justify taking such a drastic step. She resolved to invite Sophie over for dinner the next evening, hoping that in the safe environment of their home, the girl might finally open up about what was troubling her. Little did Karen know, the dinner she was planning would become a turning point in Sophie's life, and in her own. As she went to bed that night, her mind churning with worry and plans, Karen could never have imagined the events that were about to unfold. The next evening arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. Karen had extended the dinner invitation to Sophie, framing it as a casual get-together, but her intent was clear in her mind. This was perhaps her last chance to uncover the truth about what was happening in Sophie's life. As the doorbell rang, Karen took a deep breath, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She opened the door to find Sophie standing there, looking smaller and more vulnerable than ever. The girl's eyes darted nervously around, as if checking for unseen threats, before she stepped inside. "Thank you for having me over, Mrs. Johnson," Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen's heart ached at the fear she could sense radiating from the child. "We're always happy to have you." "Sophie," she replied warmly, ushering her inside. "Lily's upstairs. Why don't you go join her while I finish up dinner?" As Sophie climbed the stairs, Karen returned to the kitchen, her mind racing. How could she create an environment where Sophie might feel safe enough to open up? She decided to let the evening unfold naturally, hoping that the comfort of a family dinner might lower Sophie's defenses. Dinner started quietly, with Lily doing most of the talking, filling the silence with chatter about school and her upcoming soccer game. Karen watched Sophie closely, noticing how the girl seemed to relax slightly as the meal progressed, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. It was as they were clearing the table that it happened. Tom had just asked Sophie about her plans for the upcoming school break when the girl suddenly froze, her face draining of color. I don't know," Sophie stammered, her eyes filling with tears. He said we might go away, but I don't want to. I don't want to be alone with him." The room fell silent, the only sound the quiet clinking of dishes in the sink. Karen exchanged a quick glance with Tom before kneeling down next to Sophie's chair. "Sophie, honey," she said gently, "who is he? And why don't you want to be alone with him?" Sophie's lower lip trembled, and for a moment, Karen thought she might clam up again. But then, like a dam breaking, the words began to pour out. "Mom's new boyfriend, Greg," Sophie said, her voice shaking. He comes into my room at night. He doesn't touch me or anything, but he sits on my bed and talks to me for hours. About Mom, about their relationship, about how things are going to change. He says I'm the only one he can really talk to, that I'm so mature for my age, but I don't want to hear it. I don't understand half of what he's saying, and it scares me. I can't sleep. I can't concentrate at school. I just want it to stop." Karen felt a mix of relief at finally knowing the truth and horror at what Sophie had been enduring. She pulled the girl into a gentle hug, feeling Sophie's small body shake with sobs. "Oh, Sophie," Karen murmured, stroking the girl's hair. "I'm so sorry you've been going through this alone. But you're not alone anymore. We're going to help you, I promise." As Sophie continued to cry, Karen met Tom's eyes over the girl's head. They exchanged a silent conversation, years of marriage allowing them to communicate volumes without a word. Tom nodded grimly, reaching for his phone. "Sophie," Karen said softly, pulling back slightly to look the girl in the eyes. "What Greg is doing is not okay. It's a form of emotional abuse, and it needs to stop. We're going to have to tell someone who can help make that happen. Is that all right with you?" Sophie hesitated, fear flashing across her face. But what if he gets angry? What if Mom doesn't believe me?" "We won't let that happen," Karen assured her firmly. We're going to make sure you're safe, no matter what. You've been so brave, Sophie. Now let us be brave for you." As Tom stepped out of the room to make a call to the authorities, Lily moved to sit next to Sophie, wrapping an arm around her friend's shoulders. "I told you my mom would help," she said softly. "You're not alone, Sophie. We've got your back." Karen felt a surge of pride in her daughter's loyalty and compassion. As she watched the two girls comforting each other, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The silence had been broken, the plea for help finally voiced. Now, it was time for action. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Karen sat with Sophie, gently coaxing out more details about Greg's nightly visits, while Tom liaised with the police and Child Protective Services. Lily remained by her friend's side, a constant source of comfort and support. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Karen couldn't help but marvel at Sophie's resilience. Despite the tears that still occasionally slipped down her cheeks, there was a newfound strength in the set of her shoulders, as if the simple act of speaking her truth had lifted a tremendous weight. When the police and a social worker finally arrived, Karen was impressed by their gentle, professional approach. They spoke to Sophie in a private room, with Karen present for support. As Sophie recounted her experiences, Karen felt a mix of heartbreak and fury. The full extent of Greg's emotional manipulation became clear. How he had used Sophie as a confidant for adult problems, burdening her with information and responsibilities far beyond her years. "He said I was the only one who understood him," Sophie explained, her voice small but steady. "That Mom was too busy, too distracted. He would talk about their fights, about his past relationships, about intimate things. I didn't want to hear it, but he said I was being selfish if I didn't listen, that I needed to support their relationship." The social worker, a kind-faced woman named Ms. Reeves, nodded understandingly. "Sophie, what Greg did was not okay. Adults should never burden children with their personal problems or intimate details of their relationships. You did nothing wrong, and you're not selfish for feeling uncomfortable." As the interview progressed, a clearer picture emerged of the subtle but pervasive emotional abuse Sophie had endured. Greg had effectively isolated Sophie, making her feel responsible for his emotional well-being, while simultaneously undermining her sense of security in her own home. The late-night talks had disrupted her sleep patterns, affecting her school performance and overall well-being. When it came time to contact Sophie's mother, Amanda, Karen volunteered to be present. She knew this conversation would be difficult and wanted to offer support to both Sophie and Amanda. Amanda arrived in a whirlwind of confusion and defensive anger. But as the situation was explained to her, Karen watched the realization dawn in her eyes. The color drained from Amanda's face as she listened to a summarized version of Sophie's experiences. "Oh, God," Amanda whispered, reaching for her daughter with trembling hands. "Sophie, baby, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I thought he was just being caring, taking an interest in you." Sophie hesitated for a moment before allowing herself to be enveloped in her mother's embrace. Karen felt a lump form in her throat as she watched the two cling to each other, years of unspoken fears and misunderstandings dissolving in a flood of tears and whispered apologies. The authorities explained the next steps to Amanda. Greg would be interviewed, and depending on the outcome, legal action might be taken. Regardless, it was made clear that he should no longer have unsupervised access to Sophie. As the night wore on and plans were made for Sophie's immediate safety, Karen found herself reflecting on the insidious nature of emotional abuse. It had crept into Sophie's life so gradually, disguised as care and attention, that even those closest to her hadn't recognized the signs until it was almost too late. Before Amanda and Sophie left, escorted by a police officer who would help them secure their home, Sophie turned to Karen with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for listening, for believing me. I was so scared, but you made me feel safe." Karen pulled Sophie into a tight hug, her own eyes welling up. "You're the brave one, Sophie. Never forget that. And remember, our door is always open if you need anything." As she watched them drive away, Karen felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that the truth was out, sadness for what Sophie had endured, and a renewed determination to be vigilant for signs of abuse in all its forms. In the weeks that followed, Karen watched with a mixture of pride and concern as Sophie began the challenging journey of healing and recovery. The road ahead was not easy, but with each passing day, glimpses of the cheerful, carefree girl Sophie had once been began to emerge. Amanda, true to her word, had immediately cut ties with Greg. The authorities had interviewed him, and while criminal charges were still being considered, he was legally barred from contacting Sophie or coming near her home or school. Amanda had also started attending counseling sessions, both to process her own feelings of guilt and to learn how to better support Sophie. Sophie herself was seeing a child psychologist specializing in emotional abuse cases. Dr. Lambert worked with Sophie to process her experiences and develop coping mechanisms for anxiety and stress. Karen often drove Sophie to these appointments, using the car rides as opportunities for gentle, supportive conversations. "How are you feeling today, Sophie?" Karen would ask, keeping her tone light and non-pressuring. Sometimes Sophie would shrug, not ready to talk. Other times, she'd open up about her progress or her struggles. "I had a nightmare last night," she confided one day. "But I remembered the breathing exercises Dr. Lambert taught me, and it helped." Karen made sure to celebrate these small victories with Sophie, reinforcing the girl's growing sense of agency and control over her own healing process. At school, things were slowly improving as well. Mrs. Anderson, now aware of the situation, as Karen watched Sophie laugh at one of Lily's jokes, her face lit up with genuine joy. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. The road to recovery was long, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. But in this moment, seeing Sophie surrounded by love and support, Karen knew that they had taken the first crucial steps towards a brighter future. Later, as the gathering was winding down, Amanda pulled Karen aside. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "If you hadn't noticed, if you hadn't acted, I can't bear to think where we might be now." Karen squeezed Amanda's hand. "We're all learning from this," she said gently. "The important thing is that Sophie is safe now, and she knows she has a whole network of people who love and support her." As the last of the guests left, Karen found Sophie sitting on the porch swing, looking thoughtfully out at the yard. She sat down next to the girl, enjoying a moment of comfortable silence. "Mrs. Johnson," Sophie said finally, turning to look at Karen, Do you think I'll ever feel completely normal again?" Karen considered the question carefully. "I think normal might look a little different now, Sophie, but that's not a bad thing. You're stronger now, wiser, and you know that you have the power to speak up and change things that aren't right in your life. That's a kind of normal to be proud of." Sophie nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I think I like that kind of normal," she said softly. As they sat there, watching the sunset on another day, Karen felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey had been difficult, and in many ways, it was still ongoing. But they had broken the silence, shone a light on the shadows, and in doing so, had given Sophie the chance at the happy, healthy childhood she deserved. The experience had changed them all, making them more aware, more compassionate, and more willing to speak up in the face of injustice. And while Karen hoped they would never have to face such a situation again, she knew that if they did, they would face it together, with courage, with love, and with the unshakable belief that every child deserves to feel safe, valued, and heard.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.